Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast, where we navigate our political and cultural divides with a chaser of civility. We invite you to grab your favorite beverage and join us as we explore our differences and build bridges across our divisions. So welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast. Today we have Kai Whiting with us. And Kai, you and I have been in conversation on and off for like a year now, but we haven't sat down and had this conversation on Stoicism and maybe how Stoicism can heal some of the divisions that we are seeing right now in the world. You're coming from a different place in America, so I want to have that conversation too. But before we do, obviously you're in a different country. It's the evening. Are you drinking anything tonight?
So yeah, I actually went out and thought I had to get a very unusual drink because I normally only drink water whilst on podcasts. But I was like, this podcast deserves more because without you guys, I would never have met Jonathan Church. You are responsible indirectly for us working together. So I thought I've got to go the extra mile. So today I'm drinking a Red Bull sugar-free just because it's such an unusual drink to have on a podcast. So if I get crazy, I blame you, Jen. I blame you. But I felt like I had to do it. Like you guys are, you have a special role in our lives, Jennifer and I, and you might not know that. So yeah, Red Bull sugar-free.
Okay.
What are you drinking?
Well, it's morning for me, Kai, so I've got coffee. But I have to tell you, like, with Red Bull, it's not my favorite. But to the extent that I've had Red Bull before, it's been with vodka. Which is a really, like, crazy mix. Anyways, that's not what's happening this morning. But that, you just, let's start where you just introduce your drink, because I didn't know that. I mean, you and I had been in touch after the podcast with Jonathan Church. And it kind of dropped off and, whatever, life is crazy like it always is. But I didn't know that was where you were like, okay, this is something that we need to go on. And now you guys are actually doing stuff together.
Yeah,
so do you want to just start there with what that looks like?
So yeah, I was looking for like somebody who's applying Stoicism to unusual things, because one of the things that I'm known for within the Stoic community and outside of it is applying Stoicism to things like climate breakdown. For me, if a philosophy is useful, it must be useful in every single occasion within some limitations of what is humanly possible. To me, if a philosophy or religion is not useful to you when you're in prison and you've been in prison wrongfully, let's say you're a political prisoner, then it's not useful at all. If it's not useful when we are facing an existential crisis of some description, as a human, like a human race, like we have to grapple with climate breakdown, it's not useful to me. And if it doesn't highlight maybe an alternative way to have a very complicated discussion through things like class, which is dropped off the radar at the moment, race, religion, the sort of contentious issues, then it's no use at all. It's just an academic tool. So when I heard you guys speak, and this is probably a year ago now, I'm referring to the podcast episode, maybe a bit more, I was like, I need to get hold of this guy. Partly because I thought I could improve his understanding of Stoicism. I also felt like, he could help me understand things like white fragility, which is not my strong point. In terms of understanding D'Angelo's work, which I know you guys talked about on that episode with David. And so I thought he could help me and I can help him. So that was one thing. But also because he wasn't frightened to put his foot near the mine, right? Because it is a minefield. But if we shy away from the conversations that this podcast has, then what hope do we have to establish a better alternative? And that's what you asked. You asked a really good question. You said, you may not remember, what do you do when you have this problem? Do we have to then create a common enemy? In order to have peace within the US, do we need to say, like, let's for argument now, right now, that Putin is our common united enemy and we can see through our differences because we're united in our dislike for someone? And you said there must be a better way. So I feel like this podcast is like a year in the making, and I'm going to make a case for why Stoicism could offer, in some ways, an alternative that I think might be better in most cases, because I don't think any philosophy can be 100% the right tool in every single case, because otherwise it becomes a very blunt tool. I think you need to use it in very unique way, or very specific ways and for specific purposes. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, because it's literally been a year, and I think it's a year and 3 months, something like that.
So maybe that's the reason why there was that time there too, because there was that, and so much has happened, like you just mentioned, Putin, and we're actually like literally facing a war that we weren't facing a year ago. So yeah, I'm gonna be silent. I'm gonna jump in with questions, but I just go, Kai, just go. Tell us what we need to know.
Thank you, Jen. That's very generous of you. But well, again, I'd like to say thank you very much for allowing this conversation to take place. I think that when we, as human beings, we get frightened, we shy away, when actually we'd be less frightened if we drew together. I do feel that this podcast offers a space for that. And there are not many spaces to have this conversation. So I'd like to thank you and congratulate you for continually working on such a difficult topic. I'm very lucky that I can sort of dip in and dip out, and you're facing the brunt of this controversial discussion, right? And you face every week. So I think that shows to me a very sort of strong understanding of what humanity needs, and I could tell that by the questions. In terms of why I think I have to explain what Stoicism is, right? Before I make my case. So for those who may not know, Stoicism is an ancient philosophy, and I say ancient because it's about 2,000 something years old. It is, most people know Seneca and Marcus Aurelius, and it is a ancient Greek and ancient Roman philosophy originally, although it has continued to this day. It has become more popular. The point of Stoicism isn't the British stiff upper lip, and I can say that as a Brit, right? So it's not the idea that you have no emotions. It's that you evaluate your emotions and say things like, okay, I'm feeling sad, but why am I feeling sad? Is it appropriate for me to feel sad right now? Maybe I've misunderstood. Maybe my friend wasn't trying to be horrible to me. Maybe they're just having a bad day and I just took it badly. So it's not a case of one does not feel anything, but rather one examines an emotion and says, how useful is it in this situation to feel this way? So people often have, there's a book called, you probably have talked about it, The Case for Rage. And the Stoics would say there is no case for rage, because rage by definition is being out of your mind. It's like, I'm so angry, I was out of my mind. And if you're out of your mind, you're not thinking rationally.
Right.
So the idea that there's a case for rage, the Stoics would say no. And they say, yes, but in order to feel a sense of justice, that anger drove me. So the Stoics would say, you had to feel angry to feel a sense of justice? You couldn't just feel a sense of justice without feeling angry. So you're not being just for the right reason. You're being just because you're angry and it hurts you, not because you're seeing a situation that's unjust that you think needs to be rectified. So if you need anger to be just, then you're not being just at all from the Stoic perspective. So Stoics are not saying you should have no emotions at all. They're saying examine them. And why would Stoics be so adamant about the need to examine one's feelings and one's emotions and distinguish between reality and how you feel about it? Because they say things like the only thing that matters in life is the ability to cultivate a good moral character. A character that is incapable of making a moral mistake. So you could make a mistake, but not a moral one. So they'll say, that's an excellent human being. And so they had a word called arete. They would use it for things like a knife. An excellent knife is a knife that cuts well. And an excellent human being is a human being that is incapable of being unjust, that is incapable of being cowardly, that is incapable of being greedy, as an example of a lack of self-control, but not necessarily, and incapable of being ignorant. And they'll say, so it's not that one should not have emotions, Jen, but rather that one should really think about those emotions in the context of that kind of character. Is your sadness getting in the way of you making a wise decision? Is your anger or your frustration getting in the way of building a good, strong relationship with me, for example? Now, you made me really angry, Kai. Well, then we're not then building a relationship built on respect, love, and consideration. Mm-hmm. We're acting out of our hurt and our anger. So to recognise that we have hurt is the first step. Go, yes, you did hurt me, but that won't prevent me from doing the right thing, because regardless of how I feel about you, Jen, I'm still going to treat you justly as a Stoic. That's the concept.
Yeah, no, okay, so there's a lot going on in my mind right now. I don't want to take you off course from explaining this further. Let me tell you something that I've been looking at myself right now and where I'm feeling what you're saying. So, have you ever heard of the victim triangle?
No.
Okay, then I'm not going to take us there. But I'll just...
Well, take us there. I'd like to know. I wouldn't like to remain ignorant of the matter.
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but basically we enter into this world and we have this victim narrative that all of us do, no matter, if we come in from the wealthiest to the poorest to whatever. And there's three sides to this triangle. There is the persecutor, the rescuer, and then the victim. But we're all one and the same. We're all cycling around. Sometimes we're like the persecutor, sometimes we're the rescuer, sometimes we're the victim. And what I've been studying around this, and again, I don't want to take us too much off of Stoicism, but there's a way to get out of that triangle and to be more objective about what we're feeling. And that's what I've been doing myself a lot lately, is like, you just mentioned something, I'm angry, I'm whatever, and just sitting with that emotion and wondering why that emotion is even there. And I'll tell you what, Kai, that's not comfortable for me. Like, I want to go, for me, when I feel something uncomfortable, I go work out, I have a drink, I go out with friends, I do whatever, I read a book. I mean, not always unhealthy things like going and working out, but
yeah, of course.
But I don't sit with that emotion very often. And so this is, again, we won't get into the victim triangle. You and I will talk about that offline, or I'll put that in our podcast notes for people to look at. But I'm feeling like we're in the same wheel that you're mentioning with Stoicism, where we don't take that moment to sit with it. And I think that's a human condition. I think that's
Absolutely.
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like that doesn't matter if we're in America, if we're in the UK, whatever. Sitting with our emotions is not, we don't do that often.
Well, that's why I think Stoicism is still useful 2,000 years later, because it asks you to examine your impressions, to examine your thoughts. Mm-hmm. The only things that are in your control from a Stoic perspective are your thoughts, attitude, and actions. And it's right now. The past doesn't exist because you can't, in a sense that you can learn from it, but you can't change it. You can't interact with it in any meaningful way that would change that course. And the future doesn't exist yet. So all you have is the immediate situation. That's it. What is right now? What is appropriate for me to do right now? So people are like, what does that mean? Well, as a parent, your kid starts off, it's a good day, they then slap their sister on the back because they want the sweet that or you take candy. She told me, now you have to change your parenting. You were praising your kid, he was having a good day, and now you smacked his sister on the back. Now you have to be stern. You have to pretend to be angry with him, right? But you might think it was quite funny the way that he did it, but you're like, no, you can't do that. You cannot do that. That's completely wrong. Even though you knew you did it as a kid, even though you can see it's really funny, you didn't really mean it out of spite, but you have to act a certain way because that's appropriate right now because you're the parent. So it's like, right now, what's appropriate? So again, it's looking at your feelings and going, right, I actually think this is quite funny, but that's not the good response here. It's not useful for my daughter to think it's funny because it's not funny for her, even though the whole thing's, silly, hilarious. He wasn't being, he was just being a little bit naughty. And as a parent, you have to take that decision, right? You have to be like, I'm so angry with you right now. Just because that's, if you have that, they go, oh, mum's upset or dad's upset, I better behave, right? So it's a case of like, there are ways that we have to think about things. And then to take a very serious situation, like my grandmother was dying, and the question, why did she die, is not helpful because the answer is because she was ill. That's why she died. She was ill and her body could not, it succumbed to her, condition. A more interesting question for a Stoic is like, she died. What do I feel about it? Why do I feel like that? What am I going to do about it? Instead of going through the cycle of, but I feel betrayed, or I'm upset, I wish the doctor could have done, should have done, would have done. Okay, maybe they should have done. Are you going to be a doctor to rectify that? No. Okay, so or yes, depending on your answer. So Stoicism is like, what is going on in your mind and how can you just distinguish that? And it is a case of sitting uncomfortably with your emotion. And there's nothing wrong with going to the gym. There's nothing wrong with parking it, because also the Stoics would say sometimes you have to park that emotion and as long as you come back to it. Go, right now, I'm so annoyed that I can't even process it. What's the best thing for me to do? Go to the gym. You go to the gym and you go, right, but why did that really affect me? Why did I feel offended? Why did I feel whatever you felt? So Stoics are saying always check in with yourself. Check in with others as well, because if you're on the journey together, I might say to you, Jen, you said to me that you're interested in Stoicism, but yeah, do you realise what you just did in that cafe the other day when you didn't get, the 2 sugars, they only gave you 1? Oh yeah, I was really annoyed. Well, why were you? I don't know, I felt that I wasn't seen. Well, were you not seen because it was a big queue, or you're not seen because of the way you want to be seen, or why do you feel the need to be seen by the guy who's offering you coffee? Like there's this whole sort of feedback loop throughout. And I think that this is helpful when it comes to things like people say like microaggressions or free speech issues, because Stoics would say if you need someone else to be removed from the room to make yourself feel comfortable, you're not going to have a very flourishing life. Because you've basically said, no, I have no agency. I can do nothing. This person's just doing it to me. I need Jen to remove this gentleman from the room. As a Stoic, you'd say you can't flourish then because you're requiring Jen, who's not in your control, to do something on your behalf in order for you to feel what you think is happiness. Rather than saying, I don't like this individual. Removing him from the room isn't going to make the idea go away. I'm going to have to sit uncomfortably for the next 25 minutes and think of an appropriate question to ask him to show where his reasoning has fallen down, broken down. Or to show that maybe he's right, but there's also an alternative perspective, and that may also be equally right for those individuals, right?
Right.
And so it is about being uncomfortable and then learning how to make the uncomfortable comfortable. So, because in Stoicism, there's no way that you can rescue me. There's nothing you can do to really rescue me. All you're doing is removing somebody. But you could do that, and I'm still not satisfied. I'm still not happy because the man's now outside in the hallway and he's shouting away.
Right. Yeah. And I noticed that too. Like, I'll go and do whatever it is, like I just said, go to the gym, have a drink, whatever. And the emotion's still sitting there. It's waiting for me to come back. And I'm like, oh, I thought I banished you. So here's a question for you. So again, I know we're in 2 different countries. America right now is I feel like the UK is as well, but maybe less so. America is really divided over a lot of really fundamentally, I think, emotional issues on identity, right? Who we are.
Yes.
And a lot of these things, though, are, I feel, someone could argue differently, I feel superficial. How I look, the number of the amount of melanin in my skin. Although, though, we like the UK, we've got a history that cannot also be erased. If you had more melanin, you had a different experience historically. But we're living in today, and we're trying to make a better future, despite what happened in the past. Where does Stoicism enter into that conversation, and how can we use that to have a better conversation for a better future, despite our past?
Fantastic question. Well, firstly, I'd like to highlight the irony of people going, my lived experience, right? I don't think you can have an experience that isn't lived. You're dead when you had it. So Stoics would say, what do you mean by that? Because what experience can you have that isn't lived?
Right.
I mean, were you half dead? Were you in the Thriller? Like, were you doing this kind of movement while you were doing it?
Gosh.
What do you mean by that?
Now I've got that song in my head. Thank you very much for a Thriller in my head.
Or were you in the multiverse? Because that's Doctor Strange has just come out. But basically, you can't have anything but a lived experience.
Right.
And then people will say things like, because I have a lived experience, it's more valid because you can't possibly understand my lived experience. If I can't possibly understand you, then why explain it to me? Why explain something if I cannot, as a man, hope on, in any way, shape or form, understand the experience of a woman, then why would women explain it to me? Because I can't hope to understand it. So the Stoics would say, hang on a minute, there are aspects that you may find almost impossible to understand, but fundamentally, whilst Jen is a woman and you're a man guy, you have a human experience, and you can connect on a human level, and you can say, okay, I don't know what it's like to breastfeed my children, for example, but I can imagine that there are days when you're very tired. And if I just say as your husband, well, Jen, I think the kids need the kid needs breastfeeding. That's not very helpful because I'm giving you the only job that I know that I can't do, right? So I can be aware, and you can make me aware. So the Stoics will say through having conversations with Jen, you can understand her experience, right? Because if you can't do it, then why have a conversation? If I can't speak, I don't know, for example, if I can't speak Latvian, I wouldn't have a conversation with a Latvian. It would make no sense. So the first thing is to be careful with one's language. What do we mean by lived experience? And why do we suggest that one experience is more valid than the other? And really what's valid is the ability to communicate about that experience and say, okay, can you understand from a woman's point of view, if you just tell me to breastfeed, I don't feel that you're actually supporting me very much. If you tell me okay, you breastfeed and I'll go and do X, Y, and Z, then you feel supported because you're doing the only job that you can do and I'm doing a job that you can't do at the moment, right? So there's just the acknowledgement that we are different. Stoics don't have an issue that we're different, and we acknowledge that fact. But we use a sense of humanity, of compassion and kindness and the virtues of, as I said earlier, like justice, to think, how can I act in an appropriate way that shows Jen, if you're the mother of my child, that I do value her as the mother of my child, but she is not only the mother of my child. That's just one particular identity that she has at any one time. And that's the other thing that the Stoics would highlight, that none of us have only one identity. So I am a son, but I'm not a son. I'm not acting as a son in my capacity right now, unless I start talking about my mother. In which case I now, having now mentioned her, are acting in the capacity as a son. So the Stoics would say we have multiple identities, and they're very immediate. Like right now, what is your primary, thing that you're looking at? Yes, I'm a human being. My primary role is I'm human. Okay, what's your next role? Well, at the moment, I'm in teacher mode. So my professionalism, it has to come through because we're not having a drink in a pub where we might be speaking in a different way. I might be using more sort of naughty words, let's say, and I might be using a more slang in general. Okay, so I'm speaking to an English-speaking audience on a podcast. Okay, that's my role. When I go, when I go and, if you do have children, if I go and see them and I'm in the park, I shouldn't be talking to them like this. I should be running around if they're young, making silly faces and doing things. Why? Because my role at that point is a person who's looking after a friend's child. The Stoics would say, we have multiple identities. Multiple ones, really, because you must, by definition, identify as a daughter to somebody. You might identify as a sister to somebody else. They're not the same role. They have similar connections, but you don't act the same way. You don't treat your mum like you treat your sister. You may be a wife or a girlfriend. Did you have a different role? You may be a teacher. You may be learning a language, and then you're not acting in teacher mode. You're very much in student mode because you're learning. Let's say you're learning French. So you're not going to be like, I'm going to take the teacher role. Do you speak French? No, I think you should be a student right now. Leave your teacher role to the international relations, because I know that you studied that, and politics, and leave your French to the French teacher. Yeah. Right? So the Stoics would say, first of all, why do we emphasize beyond our role as a human being, because we always occupy that role, why is colour or ethnicity fundamentally important in every single situation? It might be, there might be times where, when I lived in Bogota, being white wasn't very helpful. So I made myself look like a backpacker, so I would get robbed less in the street. It was less likely that I'd have a problem if I looked like a backpacker. Right? Because there is a connection, even in Latin America, between being white and having money. So when I went to work in a suit, I also attracted certain crowds that maybe I didn't appreciate at the time. And maybe most people wouldn't trying to get to work on time. So you have to think, okay, so in that scenario, that may be important. If I'm in if there's a situation where I can, because I'm in a situation where the dominant culture is white in every single culture or subculture, then I could, think, okay, I am white. How can I help people who don't have that privilege in that situation? But if I walk into a mosque, for example, even if I'm in the same city, I'm no longer in what you would call a white dominant culture. So what does that mean? Mm-hmm. And so they'll say, well, in that context, could it be important? Yes, it is important. Is it important right now? No. So the Stoics would say that it can't be fundamental or fundamental importance in every single context and every single scenario.
Mm-hmm.
That's why your primary role is a human, because that's what the role you will always occupy all the time, regardless of who you're with. Like I said, if I'm not with my mother and I don't mention it, I don't act in the role as a son. It doesn't mean I'm not a son. It just means that I don't act through that identity in that moment.
Like, you're kind of, as I'm hearing you talk, you're blowing my mind in some ways. I'm not even sure how to verbalize it, because this is kind of new to me. Well, let me put it this way. It's not new to me because everything you're saying I'm feeling, but I've never learned how to express it, right? So I was just thinking about something the other day where I was in a certain conversation where I felt great confidence. You know, I was in, like you said, I was more in a teaching position. I was looked at as an international relations expert. And so I rose to that occasion. And then I was in another role, like literally within the same day, where I was the student and someone told me I didn't act with confidence. And I found that Kai jarring, because how I identify and see myself is usually on the, you know, the spectrum that I want to see, like the good spectrum, right? The confident, the teacher. Although I also see myself as the student and whatnot. Obviously, like the way I want to present myself in most instances is one with confidence and, you know, all the things that we name as good. And I really had to sit with that comment, because within one day, I felt incredibly confident, incredibly connected with people in my field. And then within an hour later, I felt incredibly disconnected. And I didn't even recognize what this person was telling me, like lack of confidence. I was like, you don't know, like my response in my head, which I didn't say, was, you don't know me. Like, how, you don't know who I am. You don't know the Jennifer. And so there's all these, so what I'm hearing from you, there's this multiverse. I hate using that word now because we know that Facebook has taken that word.
Yeah, they stole it.
And then
well, the metaverse. Yeah.
Metaverse, right?
Yeah, but it sounds very similar.
Right, okay, good. I'm glad that it's not exactly the same. To me, they were the same. But, I mean, I'm hearing you speak, and there are so many Jennifers.
Correct.
And so how do we become our best selves, though? Because, like, let's just go back to what I said. I mean, in one day, I felt as confident as Jennifer could feel, to as, like, belittled as Jennifer could feel. Where do I show up as my best self?
Well, it depends on your role. So as a student, your best self is a person who's willing to listen and learn. There's no reason why you should be as confident as a teacher in a student role, because by definition you can't be, if you wouldn't be in the class. So it is a case of, like, the Stoics are very much like role ethics. So there are multiple Kais on some level, because there is a Kai as a son, a Kai as a brother, right? A Kai as a teacher, a Kai as a student. I am learning a language, so I gave the example. I also have Kai, you know, I'm British, so when we have voting to do, you know, I have to act in that role. Is my Britishness relevant in Australia? Well, not really. If I jump up and down and say, I should be able to vote, they're like, are you Australian? I'm like, no. But why does that matter? Well, it matters in Australia. So your Britishness is relevant in the sense that you can't vote, right? So, but you can't demand the vote because you get to vote in your country. So as a Brit, when I'm in the UK, I have a specific role, which when I'm in another country, I'm a British person, I have a different role. So because now I'm a visitor, right? So it's a case of, like, the best self is the self that goes, okay, I'm not upset about somebody saying I lack confidence, because in my role as a student, it's perfectly natural to lack confidence. And I'm not, you know, you're more than even the sum of all your parts, right? Because although, you know, we said there's a role here, there's a role there. Even there's a Jen tomorrow, and there's Jen in 10 years' time. Which Jen are we talking about? And, you know, because we do things today for Jen of today, but we also have to do things for Jen who is going to have a pension. Right? So there's some things you'll do thinking about Jen in 20 years' time, even if you're not sure that Jen even is still alive. We don't know that. The same is true for everybody. So I think this is really helpful, because then we don't get tied up by one role. We don't see one comment destroy our sense of self, because it's like, well, That's my sense of self as a student. If I lack confidence, I'll just have to develop it. How am I going to develop it? By learning, by becoming, acquiring skills, and doing exactly the same process that I did as an international relations student. Because, 10, 15 years ago, you lacked the confidence, and it's through the doing in that particular field that you became an expert and you rose. And then you say, well, I'm lacking confidence in 2022, but in 2025, I won't be. And you just let it just brushes off you at that point, because then you say, they're just talking about me, Jen, in my student role.
Yeah.
So they didn't know you because they knew you in that moment. They just didn't know the other Jen that does other things.
Right. Yeah, that's it's kind of groundbreaking and novel in its simplicity, Kai. I mean, and again, we're not having these conversations. We're so consumed with this identity. And so I want to get back to that. I want to get back to how can Stoicism, how can we use that in our world, in our lives today? I mean, I think we've touched on that on our individual experiences, but as a more general application, a government, a community, a bigger application, how can we use that to change the narrative that we're having now that puts people only as these particular identities and locks them there in place and doesn't see them? I mean, this is what you were just saying. I mean, it locks them into one identity when there's so much more. How can we have that conversation where we as a community, as a country, as a state, recognize the temporality, if that's, of that particular identity that we're approaching at that one moment?
Context. Context used to be king. And now it's like, regardless of context, if we're using the whiteness kind of argument, regardless of context, white people, they are supporting a corrupt system, regardless of what they're doing, regardless of what they're thinking, regardless of who they are in any other aspect of them. They are supporting a particular system because they are white. Stoics are like, everything outside the virtues or the vices, which are the polar opposites. So I said, like, courage is a virtue, cowardice is not. They are always good because you're always going to prefer courage over being cowardly.
Right.
Everything else is context dependent. Like, so also how we use language. So people say to me all the time, oh, like, you're half British and half Portuguese. No, I can't be half this and half that. I'm British and Portuguese. I can't be half because I have two roles, depending on which one calls me at that time. So I'm not half and half. I can be half an ethnicity. I can't be half a nationality. It's impossible, right? Because what makes you a certain nationality by definition, having the documentations to show that you are. Doesn't necessarily have to be a passport, but you're recognised by a state as a member of that state, as a citizen of that state. I'm not half. I'm both. I might be half this and half that in terms of half. Let's say let's say I was half European, half Asian. Yes, because I have 50% of my parents, if that were the case. But so language is very important to be more specific about what we actually mean. So if we use the words white privilege, what do we mean by white? Because if you speak other languages, white doesn't mean the same in Spanish. Doesn't have the same connotation exactly. It's nuance. And I always point out to people who do intersectionality, you do realise that by speaking English that you're restricted by the language that you use, that your whole understanding of race is restricted by the English language context. And the minute by using English, you're using the dominant language. So there was a really good, really funny when they had, what was the film Steven Spielberg just did? Do you remember? West Side Story. So Steven Spielberg purposely did not put English subtitles when the Spanish language was spoken. I don't know if you remember that.
No.
So I am a fluent Spanish speaker, and I didn't realise until I was watching people acting unusually uncomfortable in the cinema. And I was like, wait a minute, there's no subtitles. Bearing in mind that West Side Story is to celebrate that we're all the same. That's the power of full. So Spielberg was asked, why do you not have the subtitles when, the Spanish is spoken? And he said, I didn't want to give English dominance over Spanish. Okay, but Spanish is a colonial language. Like the irony there. It's like Spanish is a colonial language. So you're telling me that one colonial language is more, is more important or less important than the other. They're both colonial. You didn't use Quechua. And there was a lot, basically, and he was saying, well, people were saying on like some quote unquote progressive publications that would encourage people to learn Spanish. No, it wouldn't. By excluding people in the cinema so they don't understand 1/3 of the film, that does everything but encourage people. So language is key to understand that the way that we see, let's say, race or gender or religion is also tied into the language that we speak. So I'll give you an example, Jen. When you break a glass in an English-speaking world, havoc breaks loose. Oh my gosh, glass must have been so expensive historically. It's like, oh, you broke a glass. Bear in mind, a lot of people buy from IKEA these days. So how expensive is that? If you break the same glass in a Spanish-speaking context, nobody asks anything like who or why or what happened. There's like, oh, it broke, because the glass in Spanish breaks itself. So if you say in English, the glass broke itself, I was like, who did it? Blame is immediately provided and offered, right? And I'm sorry, I broke the glass. Doesn't happen in Spanish-speaking context. When you're at a party in Spanish, it's like, okay, let's tie it up. That's just a really sort of interesting sort of.
Yeah.
Just blow your mind there. You're like this.
Yeah, I speak Chinese, and I'm like translating the glass broke in my head to see if there's an actor in that. And wow, that's. Okay, yes, you blew my mind. So let me ask you this with that. And here's something. Well, I've got so many questions for you right now. I loved how you said that we're not half and half. Let me just start there. Like, I'm not, it's like, it depends on what day it is and what I'm speaking. Some days I'm going to be speaking full on as a Portuguese or from my experience as Portuguese. And sometimes I'm going to be using my experience as British. Because so much in America, Kai, and this might be, I think Britain, the UK, is very multicultural. But the US it is just baked in. Like, you are always something else. And we have become addicted, if you will, to identifying with race to the exclusion of anything else. Not Jennifer, the international relations specialist, Jennifer, the Chinese speaker, Jennifer, the whatever. It's Jennifer, the white girl, right? And I think that that's true with everyone. And I'm wondering, is there a way? You just kind of explained it, but how do we actually, let me ask it this way. How do we institute a way forward that sees ourselves as our whole selves? You just mentioned it's through language, but like, what could we do to let people know? Is it through, do we have education classes on what it means to be a Stoic and what it means to have language and how we are identifying? Like, what can we actively do to say, by the way, when you talk like this, you are just playing into the same narrative? Is there a...
Exactly what we're doing today. Having conversations, but not in the sense of trying to find blame. It's not about finding blame. It's not to point the finger, because when you have the victim triangle, you're thinking, who can I point blame to in this moment? That it doesn't start there. You can only assume blame once you understand what you've done wrong, if you've done anything, or what you could have done better. So instead of saying, who must I blame? I'm a victim, then I must be oppressed. And Stoicism, the only person that can oppress you is you. Is to give people back their agency. Just because you happen to be a woman doesn't mean you have no agency. It doesn't automatically mean that you're a second-class citizen relative to a man. I'll give you a good example. As a man, it's very hard to go up to a small child and play with them in the park in a public space. As a woman, you could more easily do that. So I feel that, like today, I was in a really sunny park. It would be lovely to be able to tease a kid a little bit and run around and go, or do something like that. With their parents fully watching. As a man, it's much harder for me to get that rapport than a woman. A woman could be silly, could stick her tongue out, for example, and go, no, and run around, and no parent really mind. So as a man in that case, I'm not in the powerful position. Quite the opposite. I'm automatically seen as sinister. If I was, depending exactly what I was doing, even if I have no, I'm not trying to be inappropriate. I'm not trying to be like weird. I'm just trying to be childish, childlike, funny. Yeah. So in that situation, I don't have a privileged position. I'm actually seen as someone who shouldn't be there, that maybe that's not comfortable. Yeah. So it's highlighting that when and under what context and circumstance might one of my identities cause me an issue. Then we can have an honest discussion about racial issues. So I'll take the good example of really another red button topic. So people are having an argument about a particular swimmer who's a trans woman in Penn State University. My issue is not, in terms of that context, is not whether that person identifies as a male, female, or what their legal status is. My issue is that if that person is a woman and has taken naturally performance-enhancing hormones, they cannot compete because having taken those hormones accidentally by like nature or on purpose, they have an unfair advantage. It doesn't matter if they're a she, he, or they. The context that's important is there is a 7-second advantage, and those 7 seconds between the individual and then the next candidate is because that individual was exposed to testosterone through a pubertal period, and the other people in that swimming race were not. You see, we're going, well, why should we be worried that Leah Thomas is swimming? Is because she's not a woman? No, it's because she, if you want to use that pronoun, she's had a situation where her body has been exposed to a hormone that would give her a better performance, and therefore, by definition, it is not fair. Okay, then you have, how can we make it fair? Can we give a handicap so she can still swim with other women? Because we do that in the Paralympics. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the Paralympics, some people have one arm, some people have two arms, some people have one leg, and we have a like a handicap. Like same with sort of golf and horses and all sorts. Like if the horses, they get more weight on their saddle. So why can't we go? Okay, what's really at stake here? Because the only context that matters is those 7 seconds. Doesn't matter what Leah's really wearing, particularly. Doesn't matter what her passport says, because her passport isn't relevant in that swimming race in any level whatsoever, unless she happens to be swimming for America, and then the fact that her passport is the US is the relevance there. But that's not the relevance in terms of the argument about whether she should be able to swim or not swim. So this is, again, context is key. That we start to say, what is the issue, if any, with Leah Thomas? And then we start listening to each other instead of going, yeah, one's like going, well, Leah Thomas is like any other woman. Well, she's not. And the other one side going, well, this is about women's rights. Okay, so what is it? What right is being undermined? It's not all of the rights. Mm-hmm. So they have another argument that I thought was really funny. Like they say, a trans woman should win Women of the Year. Okay, should a trans man win Woman of the Year? Because by definition, if a trans woman cannot win Woman of the Year because she was born male, then a trans man with a really long beard and no hair at all on his head should be able to win Woman of the Year. But because we're not actually debating the nuances and the language and looking at the context-specific problem, we're having identity politics argument. It's not solving it because the issue is not really about identity. Uh-huh. It's about the unfair advantage or how we should classify who should be Woman of the Year.
So what you are arguing for, and I love this, if I hear you correctly, is nuance and complexity. We have not just context, nuance and complexity. But here's the problem, Kai. We don't do nuance and complexity. We just don't, right? I mean, everything is boiled down to 280 characters. It's a new sound bite. It's a news flash. And when I struggle with these issues, and to me, it all comes down to we need to come back and we need to change education, particularly for our younger kids. I mean, from the very get-go, where they're being taught, maybe it's Stoicism, but critical thinking and nuance and complexity. We need to be able, I don't feel like education for our young kids has kept up with social media and identity politics, which is, again, I repeat myself, the soundbite, the news flash, the whatever. And I don't know any other way to do it, because we're not gonna back ourselves out of this social media moment. This is our new reality. So how do we do this? And I love the fact of bringing Stoicism back in, and maybe Stoicism is the answer. Maybe we teach that. Maybe that becomes part of a critical thinking course. But I feel like we've got the only way to resolve what we're seeing right now is to bake this into our education, where nuance and complexity is once again admired and revered. What are your thoughts around that?
I'm not sure that nuance and complexity has been historically appreciated. As a woman, your voice was not appreciated because you're a woman. I think we've always been worried, like when the radio came out, it was like, this is a problem, and the printing press came out, the Pope had a heart attack. I don't think there was nuance and complexity in 1950 for women. The fact that you're a woman would be enough to tell you, sorry, Jen, what are you doing in the smoking room? This is not your room. And I would have been able to frog march you out of there because you're a woman. I don't think it has changed. Right? I don't think we had nuance back then. I think that the problem is that we've never really tried to argue for nuance. Right? And so we think it's social media. But ask a woman 50 years ago, could she open a bank account? Where was the nuance in that? There was none. Ask a gay man 50 years ago where the nuance was about how much he might have loved an individual. Oh, you can't possibly love another man. That's just, then I wouldn't use a swear word beginning with B if I was British, right? That's just this, right? So I don't think we've ever really focused on nuance. Yeah. I don't think we had necessarily critical thinking, because you must remember, you and I are roughly the same age in the sense of there's a lot of rote learning when we were kids about what year it was, and right. So I think it's a case of we need to value it. I do think that ancients did a lot more, but this was because their education was different. It was mentoring. So what I'm doing now is mentoring you, and you mentor me. And so whenever you had a Victorian classroom, you could have no nuance, because you're trying to teach the basics to 32 to 52 to 102 children. Historically, like that, you think about Aristotle and Stoics, they took one by one by one by one by one. There was a line of people mentoring. And even like if you take the Islamic faith, you learn the Quran from your teacher. So the way that it's pronounced and the exact sounds, it's literally corrected mistake by mistake by mistake by one individual. And the idea is that you can trace all your lineage back to the Prophet Muhammad. Right? Until you say peace be upon him, right? So everybody learns the same way. So I think it's a case of giving parents back their agency. I have seen, particularly in the US, that agency for parents is being eroded. So parents are like, oh, hang on a minute, why can't I be upset about the way you're teaching my kid? Oh, no, that means you're a Republican supporter. Regardless of whatever it is, you must be Republican supporter. So again, lack of nuance, a lot of blunt instruments. Giving parents back agency, which I was particularly happy about, under Obama, I think parents had more agency. To say that a teacher cannot teach everything, and to value true mentorship. So one of the things that I've done to address this issue is I've decided, okay, I need to offer paid mentorships because people don't know these things. And I was like, well, I should make myself available because I can do it. And I think people want to be mentored. I get emails a lot going, I want to be mentored by you because you really help me think things through. You make the normal strange, the strange normal. But this was Stoicism, like Musonius Rufus, he taught Epictetus. So most people know Epictetus is a very important Stoic philosopher. But he talked about how he made a mistake and that his mentor taught him. And he then teaches his students who make exactly the same mistake. He's like, well, I did exactly the same thing. We don't have a mentee-mentor relationship anymore. I think we've lost that. But even in like the mechanics, plumbers, we used to have that. So I don't think there's been I'm sorry to maybe upset your argument, but I just don't think there was nuance there. Yeah. I just think it's different. Instead of being before, because the main thing was, oh, I'm a man, you're a woman, and that was the key thing at that point, or I was white and you weren't. That was key. Now it's like, you're Republican or you're Democrat or you have this viewpoint. We're just, because in fact we have progressed in some aspects, we now have to find a sort of more political leaning. So it's not necessarily because you are a certain colour or a certain gender, it's because you don't align with whoever's progressive. Right? So we've always had this, in Northern Ireland we've had Protestant and Catholic. We're always looking for the differences to divide rather than differences that we can celebrate and enjoy.
Yeah.
I don't think the nuance has been there. It needs to be there, but I don't think it's been there for a long, long time.
I love what you just said. We're always looking for the differences to divide versus the differences to celebrate. And I feel like that's where I enter in the conversation. I mean, if I'm not to give myself a pat on the back at all, but having grew up overseas and seeing people who are it was shockingly different, in namely in Asian countries. And then like having to sit with that and go, that's really freaking cool,
Exactly.
And perhaps I had the luxury because I had nothing. I mean, as someone living in a country that was Burma, Myanmar, it's not like I could escape and go, I'm not comfortable. I want to live like another life. I was forced to sit with that discomfort, and I'm glad of it because it made me, I feel like, that much more accepting. So I'm trying to think of there's so much here, Kai. I think we're going to have to do this more than once, but I'm trying to think of a final question for you. I agree with you that there wasn't any nuance. I love, by the way, being wrong. I love being wrong. I love learning new things. So you're right. There was no nuance as a woman or as a gay person, years ago, or as a trans person. How do we, if there wasn't it there in the first place, do we have a blueprint for the future, or are we, is what you're suggesting, an entirely new blueprint for how we educate, how we have these conversations? And if so, how do we implement? I mean, there's so much bureaucracy. Implementing something new is so difficult. So again, I repeat myself, is there something there that we can go back to and say, hey, let's bring this back again? Or do we have to say, let's completely crash what we're doing now? Here's a new blueprint.
Yeah, both.
Okay.
There are things that we need to bring, the Stoics are very keen that it's not destroy everything that's come before you, and it's not think that everything you know something more than somebody else, just because you happen to be born in the 21st century. A lot of people go, oh, we're the most advanced we've ever been. I'm like, are we? By what definition do you want to use? We've lost our sense of wonder. I mean, for example, we live our life according to a clock. They used to say in medieval Britain, how long does it take to do that? It takes the time to milk the cows. Right, so it's going to take you as long as it would to milk the cows. Yes, all about that. Oh, it takes me the time. It's the same time as it takes me to take a piss. He literally said that. Because they had no concept of a clock, right?
Right.
No clock. Sometimes they had, they'd have a sundial, right? And it depends on the season in the UK. It doesn't have to, in the summer, it's longer the day.
Right.
So we are in some ways enslaved to the idea of a clock, which is very random. You and I are having an hour conversation, for example.
Right.
If we need to wrap up, because the idea of that, it takes the time, every podcast takes an hour. So it's just a good example because you're just seeing yourself do it. Now, I don't necessarily think we're more advanced by going, let me structure my day according to a particular hour, when human creativity, human ingenuity, and human connection is built on something that goes way beyond a particular 60-minute time period.
Right.
So I think there are times where we go, actually, I think it is beautiful to say it takes the same amount of time as it does to milk the cows. Why is that important? Because they never wished for something beyond that. Oh, I wish it took me an hour instead of 1 hour and a half. They'd be like, what do you mean? The cows take this long. It just takes the time it takes to milk them. So they didn't have this concept of I should be more productive. They're like, but you milk the cows, right? And then after you milk the cows, you do that. And how long does that take? Well, it takes the time it takes to make mead. That's how long it takes. So we've kind of enslaved ourselves to this really sort of superficial realities of going, what is it, the richness of the human experience, the richness of this conversation. How long does this conversation take? For a medieval person, it would be however long that takes. And you'd obviously have different people, because you'd have people who didn't talk much, and that would be, it takes the same time as John conversation. Maybe we might think 5 minutes. Yeah. And then, I'm going to see the vicar, and that could take longer. Or the priest, So I think that we're not always, just because we are, in 2022, it doesn't mean that every idea we have is more advanced or better. So I am concerned when we think that, because I don't always think that we are as developed, for the reason that I just said. We didn't have nuance in 1980. Why we just trick ourselves to thinking that we did. At the same time, we trick ourselves to thinking that everything that we do is somehow better. And I think a lot of people think, I need to work really hard for 8 hours a day just because someone gave me a piece of paper that says you work 8 hours, rather than working, say, 9 one day and 7 the next, because that's more, with their natural rhythm of how they do things. I know as a philosopher, you never give a particularly straight answer. But the one tool that I would like to see more of, because that's more what you're asking me, is the Socratic dialogue. What we're doing right now. We're both trying to seek the truth, and we're having a discussion about where we think that truth might lie. So you're saying, what about that? And I'm going, well, maybe that. And then I might say something and go, well, actually, I don't agree with that. And we come to a conclusion, it seems that the answer would be this. And I don't think that education now, in the contemporary sense, does encourage that. Because, again, it's not the mentee-mentor. You think Henry VIII was writing to Erasmus, for example, because it's like, as a mentor. But you think of, how we transfer knowledge literally from one person to another person. You can't do that in a Victorian classroom setting. But I don't think it's just the education sector. I think education is a lived thing, and it's consistent. Like you've educated me through the podcast and things. Jonathan educates me on stuff. And so I think that if we can just, again, check our language and what do we mean by that? Do we mean an institutionalized setting, or do we mean learning? So I think if we give children the opportunity to learn in every context that is appropriate, then I think we'll be better off. And we can discuss, as parents discussing, not letting their children be, my child's upset, I've done something wrong. No, discuss it with them. Maybe you have done something wrong, and maybe they're just being 5. So it's kind of again, finding the nuance, finding the context. But that's one relationship at a time, Jen. That's one conversation at a time. I don't think you can institutionalize the conversation we've had today.
No.
But I think that's where education begins and ends for most of us.
Yeah. I mean, what you hit on is crucial. I think it is one conversation at a time. And we can do that. Here's the thing, we say, it's too complex, we can't, but one person can talk to another person.
That's what it needs. People say to me, that doesn't change the world. It does, though, because the only thing that you can do is change your world. Again, it's language. We say, I'm going to change the world. You can't do that. Even Elon Musk, with all his power and money, cannot change the lives of 8 billion people. He can't touch everybody. Some people have never heard of him. Most people haven't even heard of him. So when you change your world, that's what you mean when we say change the world, because there's not much you can do. Okay, I guess you could drop a nuclear bomb and change the world in that sense. But most people, we can only change our world. Right. So they're like, people say, well, that doesn't make me feel very comfortable because then I'm restricted. Well, it's just reality, right? You're restricted. I can only have a conversation with you, Jen. I can't have a conversation with somebody else right now because it wouldn't be appropriate. So I'm comfortable. I'm going to enjoy my conversation with Jen. I'm going to build a relationship with Jen so we can have another conversation and continue to grow. That's what I can do right now. I can't be, let's say, cleaning the streets of rubbish or helping a child in a park. I can't be doing that because I'm doing this. So I think it's we lie to ourselves about what we think we can do rather than saying, in this moment, I can have one conversation with you. And people are like, okay, does it have to be on a podcast? No, you can have a conversation with your father, with your brother, with whoever. Right. And things do change one conversation at a time. If we think back to our own lives of when, particularly when you were younger and you thought that you knew everything, and then your parents showed you that maybe that wasn't true, or the conversation you have with the person who becomes your husband and wife, that had been one conversation. So it's interesting that we say we can't do it, yet we have a husband and wife, or wife, and we're like, well, I do know that he's really annoying when he does this, but he's not the sum of just that one mistake he consistently makes, or the snoring. We give that nuance, we give that time for that relationship. We can't give that amount of time to every relationship, but giving some time to the ones that are important, I think that's the only way we can change things. I think anything else is wishful thinking. It doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do what you suggested, but we can do that right now.
You know what's so funny is I didn't really even recognize this until this conversation. So I've got a book coming out. I wasn't even meaning to plug this, but in this book, my co-author is a black man. You know, I'm a white woman, and he says, Wink says in this conversation, we can't speak to whatever, a gazillion other people, but we can speak to each other. And I thought that was nice, whatever. I kind of heard it. You know, we kept writing, but the author of our foreword, Eric Smith, picked up on that, and he goes, this is what you can do every single day that makes a difference. And it's funny because even then I was reading, this was last week, I was reading Eric's words, and they rung true to me. It wasn't like, oh, you know, whatever. It wasn't pithy. But now I'm actually hearing you, and I'm like, that's exactly right. Like, that's all we can do.
That's all we can do.
That's all we can do.
I know somebody said to me last week, but that means I have no agency. I said, that means you have every agency. Because every decision you make, every thought you have, every attitude you decide to have, that's what makes a difference. And if you believe otherwise, you're just lying to yourself. Like, talking to me in a certain tone because you're having a bad attitude changes our relationship temporarily and potentially permanently, right? If you do it often enough. And it's like to wish anything else actually breaks our agency because we can't do it. This is why in Being Better, so the book that I wrote with Leonidas Konstantikos, which is about Stoicism and making the world a better place, we say in Stoicism, it's true, you can't put yourself in other people's shoes because your feet don't fit their shoes, because all you're doing is imagining what Jen might think or might feel as an American white woman, let's say. It won't just be that identity, there might be various of them. Mm-hmm. But I can't be you. I shouldn't pretend to. So the best thing I can do is challenge you about what you think by saying, for example, are you sure you had nuance? Try it 20 years ago, try it 40 years ago. And you go, wait a minute, I've just realised that that's not true. So I've undone a belief, and you're going to, broken a belief, which you're then going to have to fill up with whatever you think is reasonable. But to suggest that somehow I can be much more than I am is often too many times, at least in my opinion, use an excuse not to do anything. Right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean we have to be like activists, because people say, because I work on the climate breakdown issue, for example, do we have to be activists? I'm like, well, if you're not a particularly loud person, probably not. You're probably quite quiet. You can change the environment by choosing not to put meat that is commercially produced in your mouth. Right? That makes a difference. You could choose to have conversations with your kids about the environment and why it's important, but not demonize people who haven't quite got there, right? Haven't quite understood some of the message. But to explain to them where you're coming from, try to understand where they're coming from. But that's what we can do. I know self-help industry tries to tell us that we can do something different, but the reason why, in my opinion, again, why this happens is because when you fail, you just have to buy my next book. You didn't quite get there? Buy the next one. Come on. That's why I think that we have this sort of, you can plan 5 years in advance. Well, why would you want to do that? You can have an idea about what you might want to achieve, but planning 5 years in advance, and when you fail, buy my next book, it's a very convenient business plan, isn't it?
Yeah. All right, we have got, this was just scratching the surface, because I really do see this as a mentoring for me, and I appreciate you being so open with taking my questions. I mean, there's so much about Stoicism that I'm unfamiliar with, but I know that I like it gels with me, right? But I'm not, I don't, the nuance of it is beyond me. So, Kai, I hope that we continue this.
Certainly, I certainly hope so. I look forward to, I hope we can get Jonathan Church on there as well, because we can go really into some of the nitty-gritty of the more complexities and nuances that he would be better to in my opinion, explain in some ways. But I think I'm hoping that your audience appreciated that it's in thinking through what we believe to be true and then evaluating it, looking at the impression and going, what is it that I'm really thinking? What does that mean? I think that's powerful. And that's something that we can practice in everyday life. So we don't have an institutional response, but we don't need one. Because we just need enough teachers to know what it's like to to think critically and pass that on to their students. And one last thing I will say is that one of the things that I always got frustrated is that people will say things like, oh, I didn't feel encouraged because the teacher didn't look like me, right? Well, my answer is somebody doesn't have to look like you to help you. They have to believe in you regardless of what you look like. That's, to me, the powerful thing. Because, if you speak to a male teacher, he's got a beard. How many kids have beards, for example? So he's not likely to look like you in that aspect. Why zoom into the one, the melatonin in his skin or what he has between his legs? I think the key thing as a teacher is a desire to help your student regardless of what they look like, and precisely because you value their desire to learn, to grow, and to be a reasonable citizen. If we can do that, I think that things can change, as that is an individual by individual basis.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you said that. And that's so true. It's not about what they look like, it's whether or not you give a shit.
Yes. Do you care enough?
Yeah. Do you care enough
about the student in front of you?
Yeah.
Does the student also care enough about them being there? Because you can care. If they don't care, there's not going to be much rapport. But yeah, it's nothing to do, for example, you think about it. If I teach, no one in the classroom, if their children have beards. I've never met a child who's got a beard to this day. None of them are my height. And I'm quite sure, but none of them are my height. So that's another difference.
Yeah.
None of them are balding, thank God. So that's another difference. None of them were born in the year that I was born, so that's another difference. You see, when we break it down, it's the other thing that I like to point out to people is like, when people say, oh, I know what it's like to be 21. Yes, you know what it's like to be 21 in 1978. Do you know how relevant that is right now?
Right.
Not relevant.
Right.
It's not relevant. You can learn something, because you can say as a man, you definitely say as a man, when you're in your 20s, you do feel it more, some of the hormones, right? And that is across the board. But to say, I know what it's like at a 21-year-old, no, you don't, because the interest rates were different. The politicians were different. Right?
My son reminds me of that all the time. Yeah. I'm like, I know what it's like to be 18. He's like, really, Mom? Really? And I'm like, okay, maybe not.
Yeah, some aspects. And again, it's like, so which aspects do you know?
Right.
Things like the desire to learn, to grow, to think that you know more than you do. Because we can all say that. Again, this is why the Socratic dialogue, because if we all came together, we'd all nod, right? Anybody over the age of about 25 would all nod and go, yeah, that's exactly what happened. And we have that universal experience. But that doesn't mean that we understand exactly what it's like to be 18 in 2022.
Right.
We just don't. So that's something that we need to think about, like, okay, where can I draw the line? Where does my talking end and my listening start? Mm-hmm. And I think that's also something we can do to improve the situation.
Where does my talking end and my listening start? That's key right there too. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes to see what each of us is reading. Different news with different views. You can find us at holdmydrinkpodcast.com, all major podcast platforms, and on YouTube. Or subscribe on Substack at truthinbetween.substack.com so you never miss an issue. If you want to join our Discord community, drop us a line. And until next week, may your conversations be constructive and your divisions diminished. Cheers.